Hello, everyone. I'm Sunae Kim. I work in the Department of Developmental and Clinical Child Psychology. Today, I'm going to talk about cultural difference in metacognition in young children. So, what is metacognition? Metacognition is defined differently by different scholars and researchers, but we can define it as understanding and assessment of one's own cognitive and mental processes. Thoughts about thoughts, reflections of one's own inner thoughts, or an ability to monitor and control memories, thoughts, reasoning, etc. And there are two forms of metacognition, implicit and explicit. And explicit metacognition is defined as our explicit or sometimes verbal assessment of our own cognitive processes and outcomes, and that include conceptual understanding of such cognitive processes, whereas implicit metacognition is defined as our access to or an appreciation of our cognitive process without conscious or explicit understanding, and doesn't include conceptual understanding, and often based on some associative heuristics such as fluency. So, for example, how often, how easily an answer comes to our mind, and these cue guides our implicit understanding or implicit metacognition. Why do we bother about metacognition? Metacognition is considered as one of the advanced human cognitive abilities. It is involved in our everyday learning and decisions and related decisions and behaviors, and also related to academic performance in children. So, for example, students who are aware or are able to assess accurately their own uncertainty about their knowledge status, their memory performance, are better able to come up with appropriate strategies and also be able to know how much more effort to put in and where to put in, and even to stop putting more effort. And these have been documented in empirical studies. So one thing to note is that cultural modulation of metacognition has not been studied much. Of course, if we consider that metacognition is fundamentally involved in our everyday decisions and learning, then we might expect the metacognitive abilities to develop similarly across different cultures, especially in early childhood, because there is less or little cultural influence compared to, let's say, adulthood. Recent studies begin to show, as you see in the screen, that metacognitive abilities are present in toddlers and even in infants. But does culture modulate metacognitive abilities? First, I would like to introduce some cultural studies that demonstrate that culture modulates adults' basic cognitive abilities, including basic perceptions and attentions and judgments and inferences. And then I will move on to talk about some developmental studies showing that children's mind reading, executive function, and learning are modulated by culture. Then I will turn into some studies of mine showing that cultural differences and similarities in two specific cultural groups, Japanese and German children, in terms of their metacognitive abilities. So here, Markus and Kitayama conceptualized and demonstrated in many empirical studies and characterized the cultural difference in terms of independent self versus interdependent self. So a lot of social practices and rituals are organized in terms of our understanding of the self, perception of ourself. And in the Western cultures, the emphasis is on the independence of self from other people, whereas in Asian samples or Asian population, the emphasis is on interrelatedness of the self to other people. And these cultural differences in terms of how the perception of the self and the meaning of the self has huge implications for um, our understanding of our own behavior and others' behavior and attribution of success and failure, and even affect the people's mental health and well-being. So to demonstrate the cultural differences documented in adult literature, for example, explaining behaviors in terms of internal attributes such as personality, goals, and attitudes are very common, especially in Western culture. And this trait inference is not automatic or spontaneous in Asian samples. Oftentimes, Asians tend to explain behaviors of their own and others in terms of not traits, goals, and attitudes, but in terms of duties, social relationships. And these have been also shown in children. And also in terms of internal motivation, choice made privately as opposed to publicly is more likely to enhance internal motivation in European American samples than Asian samples. And European Americans tend to work harder with the free choice task as opposed to forced choice task and compared to Asian samples. Just to give you some ideas, Na and Kitayama asked participants, adults, to solve the IQ test. And while the participants were solving the IQ test, in front of their desk, the poster was hung on the wall, which had some sort of the figures and explanation of the studies. And one of the figure looked like this, that had some facial simple facial expressions. And what it was intended to do was to prime participants to be watched by other people. So it was a priming study. And what they showed is that when they were primed by the social eye, Asian Americans performed better. Their IQ performance test results were much better than European Americans. And these differences are also documented in both ERP and fMRI studies. So as a result of engagement in cultural practices and rituals, this change happens at the neural level. For example, there is a particular brain region that is activated when one is engaged in self-description or self-referencing. And this is a case for both Westerners and Asians. However, Asians have shown that these particular brain region was greatly activated when they were asked to describe not themselves but someone close to them as opposed to a public known figure. Another way that researchers have tried to characterize this cultural difference is in terms of analytic versus holistic reasoning and attention styles. People in Western cultures tend to focus on organized objects in terms of categories and rules, and tend to focus on the focal objects that is central as opposed to context or background. Asian adults or Asians, by contrast, tend to focus on the context and background and also the relationship between the objects. So let me demonstrate what I mean by this. Masuda and Nisbett in 2001 showed participants a short video clip, and one of the video clips looked like this. And as you can see, there are some fish and it's a moving scene. And after watching this short video clip, participants were asked to describe what they saw. So what they found is that Americans tend to start their sentences by referring to an object that is focal and central, moving fast, that is big, whereas Asians, in this sample, it was Japanese. Japanese adults tend to start their sentences by referring to context, object that is in the background, small, is non-moving. And in fact, what they reported is that Japanese tended to report the context 60% more than Americans. In Norenzayan, in 2002, asked participants, for example, as you can see here, which of these two groups, group 1 or group 2, that the target object is similar. So they asked, which group do you think that target object looks similar? And maybe you can also try yourself, which one do you think the target object belongs to or similar? And what they found is that Western samples tend to choose group 2, whereas Asian samples tend to choose group 1. Here in group 1, there is no single feature that is shared by all these members of the group, including target object, but is overall similar across, whereas in group 2, there is one single feature, which is a stem that is shared by all members, including the target object. So there is a unidimensional criteria that defines these groups. And also, cultural differences appear in terms of the visual attention. People allocate their visual attention differently depending on the cultures. So in this study, participants were asked to rate how much they like each picture for about 3 seconds, and during that time, their eyes were tracked. And what they found here, the Asian samples were Chinese. So Chinese participants and then the American participants, they were compared, and American participants tend to look at the focal object that is in central much faster and fixated longer than Chinese participants. So Asians' visual attention is broader, whereas Westerners' attention is narrower. And how we might explain all these differences? Asians tend to live their lives and their focus on social relationships. Their social network is very complicated or complex, and each one is defined in terms of their social roles within the social context. So attending to the context is important for them to function well in the society, whereas Westerners, because they emphasize independence, attending to the context doesn't do much effective job for the social functioning. And these cultural differences are fundamentally rooted in their social structure and social practices. So these differences, cultural differences, do not just apply to Asian versus Westerners, but also apply to those cultural populations that organize their social lives, which resemble either Asians or Westerners. So for example, the studies show that Eastern Europeans are more similar to Asians than Western Europeans, and also South Italians are more similar to Asians than North Italians. And consequently, their reasoning style, attention, and perception, which I already talked about, are similar along these lines. Now, moving toward childhood, these child-rearing practices in interaction with children and parents reproduce their attention styles, their attitudes that reflect cultural specific beliefs and cultural specific attentions and meanings. To demonstrate this, as an example, American mothers label objects and attributes in playing with toys with their infants, whereas Japanese mothers use social routines and contexts. In conversation with their toddlers, more nouns are produced in American mothers, whereas more verbs in Chinese mothers, and correspondingly, more verbs are documented in Chinese-speaking toddlers. This study is conducted by Imada, Carlson, and Itakura. They tested Japanese and American children of ages 4 to 9, and children were tested on a variety of tasks related to context sensitivity. And they found by 6 years, cultural difference emerged, and in one of the tasks, even at the age of 4, there was cultural difference. One thing to highlight here is that cultural difference appear even in the early childhood. Now, ethnographic observation reviewed by Kline in 2014 shows that learner-oriented teaching, which is often emphasized and frequently practices in Western culture, is not prevalent across many other cultures. In fact, in some cultures, child-directed teaching is simply non-existent, and rather children observe adults or older siblings perform the daily activities and tasks, and they're not even explicitly taught, but they rather observe and gradually become experts and perform on their own. In one of my studies in collaboration with others, we demonstrated that 4 and 6-year-old Japanese children were better in their teaching role than in learning compared to German children, perhaps reflecting that Japanese overall attunement to other people's needs, in this case, the informational needs. And in this study by Woodward and Shneidman and Gaskins showed that these cultural differences in terms of the interaction, particularly in learning and teaching, appear even in infancy. Yucatan Mayan culture is particularly interesting because this culture is one of the cultures I already mentioned that infants are not directly addressed to and they're not directly taught. And these differences compared to U.S. infants, they demonstrated that Yucatan Mayan infants display different patterns of learning from other people compared to U.S. infants. What about mind reading ability? In developmental psychology, it has been argued that there is a universal sequence of mind reading development. But Japanese children pass false belief test, which is one of the mind reading developmental component, later than their Western counterparts. Japanese children understand others' actions in terms of social constraints rather than mental states. And there are even studies that challenge this universal sequence of mind reading development. Just to mention the emphasis here and the message that I wanted to point out is that there is cultural differences in terms of mind reading. Now, this study was in collaboration with others, and the purpose of this research was to test different theoretical accounts on relationship between mind reading and metacognition. And for the purpose of the current today's talk, this is not the issue. But the reason that I wanted to point it out and introduce this was that we found that 4-year-old Japanese children and German children did not show difference in terms of their metacognitive abilities. And here, the metacognitive abilities were assessed in terms of their assessment of their own knowledge states. And by the way, we found difference in terms of their mind reading. In another study that is in collaboration with others, it's an ongoing study, and we adopted the established design by Hamburg and Getty, because this study was the first study that demonstrated that metacognitive monitoring and control are present during preschools, but also develop during preschool years. And so we adopted this study and tested 3 to 5-year-old German and Japanese children, and the preliminary analysis shows that Japanese children seem to do better than German children in terms of their metacognitive monitoring and control. Okay, final remark. Today's talk, I demonstrated cultural differences and similarity in metacognition, as well as other cultural differences in adults and children. Although it was brief and quick, I hope it was interesting. And if you have any questions on any of the articles that I mentioned or any of the comments that I made, please email me and I would be happy to answer your questions. Finally, I would like to point out and emphasize that metacognitive abilities are various and there are different metacognitive components. And we don't know really much about cultural difference and also how developmentally metacognitive abilities are acquired in different cultures. So by studying diverse cultural populations, by then only we will be able to better understand the basic human cognitive abilities. I thank you for your attention.